I packed 3 things into my bag before flying out: a tent, a radio, and a list of names nobody else thought was worth chasing anymore. Most people my age in the early 70s were chasing concerts and new jobs and the next big thing happening back in the city. I was chasing a rumor about a soldier who, as far as I could tell, still believed the war was happening. The jungle on that island was loud in a way cities never are. Insects, rain, the occasional bird call that wasn't actually a bird, the kind of silence that somehow still has a heartbeat to it. I'd spent days walking trails that hadn't seen a Japanese visitor in decades, calling out into the trees, half expecting nothing back at all. This is the man history would eventually call Hiroo Onoda, a name that means very little to most people outside Japan even now, though when I finally found him, deep in that same jungle, he didn't introduce himself as a man out of time. He introduced himself as a soldier still on duty. Let me back up, because the part most people know, the part that's already turning into a kind of joke online almost 50 years later, leaves out how this actually started. In late 1944, Onoda was a young Japanese intelligence officer trained specifically in guerrilla warfare, sent to that island with direct orders from his commanding officer: keep resisting no matter what, never surrender, never take your own life, and disregard any news that the war has ended unless an order to stop comes from a superior officer standing in front of you in person. He followed that order with a level of discipline that, depending on how you look at it, is either deeply admirable or quietly tragic. When Japan formally surrendered in August 1945, leaflets started falling from the sky over that jungle, announcing the war was over. Onoda and the small group of soldiers still with him examined those leaflets and decided, based on details they thought looked inconsistent, that it was an elaborate Allied trick. Not a hasty guess. A reasoned conclusion, built from training that had specifically warned them enemy propaganda would try exactly this. So they kept going. For years. Then for more years after that, long after anyone reasonable would have assumed it was safe to stop. The group didn't stay together the whole time. One soldier walked out and surrendered to Filipino forces in 1949. Another was killed in a shootout with a search party in 1954. A third, a man named Kozuka, was killed by local police in 1972, an incident that quietly confirmed to the Japanese government that Onoda might genuinely still be out there, still alive, 27 years after the war most of the planet had already finished mourning, rebuilding from, and moved on past. Here's the part that's harder to make light of, and I want to say it plainly instead of rushing past it. Believing they were still fighting an active war, against an enemy they assumed was still actively occupying the region, Onoda's small group carried out real guerrilla activity over those decades, burning local rice harvests they believed were supplying the enemy, exchanging gunfire with police and villagers who they genuinely believed were enemy combatants or local collaborators working against Japan. People on that island were hurt, repeatedly, across nearly 3 decades, because one man's sense of duty never received the update everyone else's had. Discipline and tragedy were not separate threads in this story. They were the same thread, running the entire length of it. Multiple search efforts tried to reach him over the years, each one more elaborate than the last. Leaflets translated carefully into the exact Japanese he would have spoken. Loudspeaker broadcasts played from the tree line at night. Letters from his own family, printed in newspapers and dropped from planes, including ones in his own brother's handwriting. Onoda later said he examined each one for the same kinds of inconsistencies he'd been trained to look for, a misprinted character here, a phrasing that felt slightly off there, and each time, found a reason to conclude it was fabricated. The harder people tried to convince him the war was over, the more convinced he became that this was simply what a sophisticated, ongoing deception was supposed to look like. In a strange way, every well-intentioned rescue attempt only proved his original training right. So picture the moment I actually found him. He stepped out from cover with a rifle that had clearly been maintained, not abandoned, for decades. I told him the war had ended in 1945. He told me, calmly, that he could only stand down on the direct order of his actual commanding officer, delivered in person. Not a leaflet. Not a stranger with a backpack. The literal man who had given him the original order, standing in front of him, saying it was over. That part alone should tell you everything about who I was dealing with. I wasn't trying to convince a man who'd simply lost track of time. I was negotiating with a soldier whose entire framework for trusting information had been built, on purpose, decades earlier, specifically to survive encounters like the one we were having. I went back to Japan and found that exact commanding officer, a man who had spent the intervening decades as an ordinary bookseller, about as far from active military command as a person can drift. I brought him back to that island. On March 9, 1974, in front of me and a small gathered group of villagers and officials, that former officer read aloud the actual orders relieving Onoda of duty, word for word, in the same formal tone such orders would have carried 30 years earlier. Onoda stood at attention in a uniform he had somehow kept intact and serviceable for 29 years, listened to every word without moving, and only then, formally, accepted that the war was over. He presented his sword. He saluted. 29 years after most of the world had already rebuilt entire cities, raised children who knew nothing but peacetime, and moved several generations past the conflict, he was finally allowed, by his own internal rules, to stop. Here's the detail that still gets me, the one I keep turning over even now. He wasn't confused. He wasn't simply lost or forgetful. Every single choice along their way was the product of careful, consistent reasoning, applied with total discipline to a set of facts that had simply stopped being true decades earlier and that nobody he trusted had personally walked up and told him otherwise. The system worked exactly as designed. The system had just never been told the war was over by a source it was allowed to believe. Does that sound like a uniquely wartime problem to you? Or does it sound like something quieter that happens constantly, a set of rules someone gave you once, years ago, that you've kept faithfully following long after the situation that justified them has completely changed, because nobody you consider a legitimate authority on the matter has ever personally told you, face to face, that it's safe to stop? Maybe you're still operating by an old rule from a relationship, a job, a version of yourself that ended a long time ago, and some part of you is still waiting for an official, in-person release from duty that may never actually come, because the world rarely sends a commanding officer to formally tell you the war is over. Usually you just have to decide, on your own, quietly and without a ceremony, that it's safe to put the sword down, even when no one in a uniform ever shows up to grant you permission. When Onoda finally returned to Japan, by his own account, the country disoriented him more than the jungle ever had. Cars, prices, the sheer pace of a place that had spent 29 years becoming something entirely new while he stood still inside a single unfinished order. He eventually moved to Brazil and ran a cattle ranch for years, later returning to Japan to found survival camps for kids, trying to pass on whatever it was that had kept him alive for 29 years in a war that, for everyone else, had already ended before some of those kids were even born. He spent the rest of his life, in his own quiet way, still trying to be useful to people younger than him, just with a very different definition of the mission. I think about that jungle sometimes, the radio static, the names on my list, and the look on his face right before that order was finally read aloud, the exact moment when nearly 3 decades of unbroken discipline finally had somewhere to go. I went looking for a man people had started treating like folklore. I found someone who had simply never been given permission, by anyone he trusted, to stop.